And I'm really honored and excited about being invited to speak to this group. The more I learn about this group, the more excited I get. So, as Holly said, I work a lot in the tropics, and where I work a lot is what's called the neotropics. So I'm going to talk a lot about that. And towards the end of the talk, I'll try and bring, as Holly said, reflect what some of my work has done and reflect on what that might mean for the conservation of Africa wildlife. So if I can do this, so just to show you what the talk is going to do, I'll give you some context and background of some of the work. And hopefully it's not too, I tried to not make this particularly complicated or technically complicated. Not that the group doesn't understand those things, but those kind of details are for papers, not for presentations like this. And then I'm going to talk about climate change, but specifically about bird populations and precipitation. And then I'm going to talk about what we know about bird populations and precipitation based on my work, some collaborative work that I've been doing with climate modelers and other people on what the projected changes in rainfall regimes are for the conservation of tropical birds and tropical systems, really, in Central and South America, and then talk a little bit about the prospects for Africa in terms of just what might need to be known. So really, I'm going to develop a case history of how you learn things about where climate refugia should be, what they are, and then maybe that'll spark a discussion, I hope, on some of the things that need to be known and some of the work that may have already been done that I'm just not aware of for Africa. So keep going here. So just a little bit of basic geography. This is the tropics, between Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn are what define the tropical latitudes. And the tropics are often, it's kind of a colonial thing, but they're split into the paleo or old world tropics and the neotropics. So I'll be referring to the neotropics quite a bit. And that basically is Central and South America. And if you look at, I'm going to be talking mostly about birds, but my remarks right now really apply to almost all levels of biodiversity, is there's clearly a concentration of biodiversity at tropical latitudes. So you can see here, this is just for birds, and you can see at the tropical latitudes where the warmer colors are, and this is just what's called a heat map, you can see that the tropics just light up, and that the concentration of biodiversity for trees and for insects and amphibians, birds, and mammals is very high at tropical latitudes, and it's extremely high for birds anyways, for extremely high in the neotropics. And unfortunately, what we have here is, this is another heat map in the geography of biodiversity threats, and this is a bit dated. If this was updated, the areas, especially in Brazil, these areas here would be bright red because there's much higher threats here. But this is probably about a 15 to 20-year-old map, but it's pretty and it makes the point. You can see that not only do we have a concentration of biodiversity at tropical latitudes, but we also have the geography of biodiversity threats concentrated in these latitudes as well. And for birds, if you're an avian ecologist or an avian population biologist, this is really concerning. There's about 10,000 species of birds globally, and about 40% of them occur in the neotropics alone. And just the diversity there is just phenomenal. The country of Colombia, which is right here, which is not all that large, has almost 2,000 birds on its list. That's 2 out of every 10 species of birds have been seen in Colombia alone. That's in the continent of Africa, the last time I checked, and this is with chatbot GBT, about 2,300 species of birds have been recorded in the continent of Africa. So in Tanzania, about 1,100 species. So you just got high, very, very high biodiversity. And what conservation biologists think about a lot is the neotropics and the paleotropics, the tropics in general, because that's where you have a lot of unique species. So given that there's a lot of things going on there, and people ask me, why do I work in the tropics? And my flip answer is, well, that's where the birds are. We know very little about what's going on with the ecology of tropical systems, and really about the dynamics of avian populations, communities at tropical latitudes, especially compared to what's known in Western countries at northern tropical latitudes, so North America, Canada, and Europe. And the sheer volume of studies and of information we have to draw on is strikingly different. And so we have that issue. This is for those of you that are interested, this is a red-capped manakin. And this is a male. They're a species where the males are way, way brighter than the females. And so this kind of presents an issue where we know where the biodiversity is located, where it lies, but we really don't know a lot about what makes it tick. And that is an open invitation for people like me that try and work down in those areas, and a lot of other people that are doing work there as well. So despite the fact that we don't know a lot, there have been, for the neotropics, a few studies have started to come in that are starting to show that there may be some issues, there may be some systematic declines with neotropical birds. And I'm not talking as much about the migrants as I'm talking about birds that are resident in the neotropics in Central and South America. And this is just a sample. There's a few real long-term studies that have been taking place there, one of which I've been involved with in the Republic of Panama. This one here in Ecology Letters has to do with a study in Brazil, a long-term study in Puerto Rico, long-term study in Ecuador, and a long-term study in Peru. All of these are starting to show that there may be things are holding on relatively steadily, or there are declines. And why these declines are occurring is a question that a lot of us are asking, and we're trying to figure that out. But what I'm going to talk about today is trying to say, okay, there are some declines. Where does climate change play a role? What might be going on with climate change? Obviously, the big issue is habitat loss. 5 millions of square kilometers of neotropical forest habitat are lost each year. But I'm going to be talking mostly about climate change and what that might do with the populations of tropical birds. Okay, and there is one, I tried to look for some of the long-term studies on populations of African birds, and this is one study that's brand new that I ran across, and this is in Nigeria. And happily, this study reports pretty good news that this does not, this is I think an 18-year-old study, or an 18-year study that's lasting 18 years. And it reports that things are holding on pretty well. So hopefully, as more studies come in, that tends to be more of the story there than what's going on in South America. Okay, so I mentioned where I worked is in the Republic of Panama. That's the country that sort of links South America with the North American continent. It's the Isthmus of Panama. And this is where the Panama Canal is. You've all probably heard of the Panama Canal. It's been there since 1914. And I worked in a park in the Panama Canal watershed, and something called Parque Nacional Soberanía, which is Sovereign National Park. If you know the history of Panama, you know why they named it Sovereign National Park. And where I work is a road that goes through this park called Pipeline Road, the Camino de Oleoducto, and it allows access to a place where a study has been going on that I didn't start, but a study's been going on since the late 1970s that I was involved with for about 30 years, and now one of my former graduate students, Corey Tarwater, is in charge of. And it constitutes the longest term population study of neotropical birds anywhere. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've learned from all those data. Where I work specifically is a place called the Limbo Basin, and it's a sort of a flat area that allows us to work there. It's kind of hard to do a lot of work when you're going up and down slopes all the time. And this habitat is what's called lowland tropical forest or moist forest. It's not rainforest. A lot of people think all the tropics is rainforest. there's actually a lot of variation within the tropics having to do with rainfall. And I'll be talking a lot about rainfall. How much rainfall and when it falls during the year drive just about all the biology of tropical systems. And what we did was we did a lot of what's called mist netting. And some of you may be familiar with mist netting. You put nets up in the understory of the forest. The birds can't see the nets and they fly into the net, and then you have them in the hand. This is a fasciated ant shrike, and it doesn't hurt them. We band them and we measure them, and we sometimes put color bands on them like this bird, and then we let them go. And it's a relatively non-invasive. And then over the years, you recapture these birds. And so you build up these databases of captures and recaptures of individuals because these leg bands are numbered. So we can actually tell when we've caught the same bird over time. And there's a lot of statistical techniques available to model the populations of these birds with capture, mark, recapture data. And that's what I'll be talking about very generally today. And the things that you can estimate with these models are how long they live, what their survival rates are, size of their populations, how many new birds come in annually, and what's called population growth rates. If you're familiar with that, that's often called a quantity called lambda. And population growth rates for conservation biologists are very important. If population growth rates are above 1, that's a good thing. That means it's growing. If it's below 1, that means, well, they're not doing that well. And if it's at 1, that means the population over time is replacing itself, and that's good news. So we built up this database with hundreds of species and thousands of captures. And we asked a couple questions about what's going on with their survival rates and whatnot. But these days, we tried to start to relate some of these long-term trends that we were noticing, and some of these demographic traits of the populations we were studying, and tried to relate that to climate change. 57 of the species that we looked at what their trends in their local abundances are, and found out that this is a paper by Henry Pollack, my graduate student, and 40 of 57 or 70% of the species that we sampled, and this is only a subset of the species here, there's hundreds of species in this forest, but you only capture the understory birds, and we were only had enough data to look at about 57 species, and that's after over 40 years of sampling. But 70% of these species appear to be declining. It's very concerning, and it's also consistent with a lot of the other studies that I showed you. So we asked a question, okay, what's going on with this? And one, as I mentioned before, rainfall is a real determinant in rainfall, changes in rainfall, or rainfall patterns or rainfall regimes really drive a lot of the things having to do with populations of birds. And it's probably an indirect effect. If there's more rainfall, there may be more arthropods, there may be more food, there may be better conditions to breed in, and better conditions to survive in. But if we, in this area and where I work, it has a distinct dry season. If the dry season is longer, often due to El Nino southern oscillations, then conditions are dry, it shortens the breeding season, and there's not as much food there. There's just a lot of things that can go on with the severity of seasonal drought. So we asked the question about, okay, given that a lot of these species are decreasing, what's going on with variation in rainfall? Is there something responsible with rainfall that may be leading to this decrease? And the long-term answer right now in this particular area is no, because there hasn't been a systematic or a long-term change accompanying these decreases. But because we did have these long-term data, we were able to ask, okay, how does annual variation affect the population by all of these species on an annual basis? If given in a given year it's really dry, do they do less well? Do they produce fewer babies? Do survival rates go down? So we were able to ask that question. And there's a lot of basis for looking at this relationship between rainfall or seasonal drought or changes in rainfall and the integrity of tropical systems. And the forest ecologists in South America have been on this for years. And a lot of work is coming out where meteorological drought and wet periods in the Amazon, the length of the dry season, are there long-term trends? in rainfall regimes. What's going on there is that leading to what in extreme will be called the savannahization of tropical forests, where they actually reach a tipping point and undergo wholesale change in the structure of these forests. Where I happen to work in Panama, there hasn't been a long-term trend in rainfall regimes. It's getting a bit drier, or there have been some changes, but there's some of the places in South America where they've been looking at, it's been getting drier and drier. So there's a lot of regional variation in what's going on. And the conceptual basis for this to say, okay, what's going on with animal or wildlife populations and populations of birds was recently conceptualized by Alice Boyle in this paper. And she conceptualized something called the hygric niche, or the hydrology niche of tropical endotherms or warm-blooded animals, where if conditions get too dry, they don't do too well. And if conditions get much, much wetter, these species don't do really as well. And this was sort of taking off of the principle of the thermal niche, where if things get colder or hotter, then the species is out of its comfort zone, so to speak, and it just doesn't do as well. So there's a conceptual basis for this now with rainfall as well, and the integrity of bird populations and the welfare of these populations. So we asked, are there associations between variation in rainfall and avian demography, at least where I worked in Panama? And the thing that we looked at was length of the dry season. So the dry season here usually goes from late January through April, okay? And then it starts raining a lot. It rains every day. But the length of that dry season varies from year to year, and it really varies having to do with El Nino southern oscillations, or ENSO events, as we call them. And these peaks in the length of the dry season through this time period are associated with El Nino. And these troughs here, the really short dry seasons, where the severity of seasonal drought is much less, have to do with the La Nina, which often follows the El Nino thing. So we just took this variation and looked at the data we have on the populations of these birds and tried to relate the two. And what we found out was that longer dry season and more severe seasonal drought. We looked at 20 species on this. The models we used on this are very data hungry. About 8 of those species was associated, really affected things. So when there's long seasonal drought, it really makes a difference on the success of that bird population in the following year. Their population growth rates go down significantly. And in a lot of species, there was a trend towards a negative association between how severe seasonal drought was, but it wasn't what we call statistically significant. But all but 2 of the species had a negative association. And if you take that, and what these lines are just sort of the slope of that relationship. If you sort of take, okay, the length of the dry season and population growth rate, or lambda, and you model that, these are the slopes that we got. This is the average dry season here. In a situation where the dry season is expected to get longer, what would happen? And you can see that in some of the areas in South America and whatnot, the dry season is expected to get 15 to 20% longer. You can see that the population growth rates, at least based on what we found in Panama, would be negative a lot. This would be in the average year when you start to get longer dry season. So this is very, very concerning. So as I mentioned, the work we did in Panama is just one place. It's just one study. There aren't many like it, but there was just one study. But we took what we learned and we said, okay, what might be the prospects for this in the neotropics in South America a lot? This is where I'm going to start to talk about climate refugia. And to do this, I hooked up with a couple of climate modelers, Dr. Rong Fu and Mingjing Kuo, who are at the University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA, and also another tropical bird ecologist and some spatial analysts that know a lot of GIS, which I know very little about, Dr. David Luther and Justin Cooper. And what we did was we just took, okay, what do the climate models say for what the rainfall regimes in the entire neotropics are going to do between 2080 and 2100 by the end of the century, excuse me. And we based our projections on two scenarios for climate change. One is shared socioeconomic pathway, or SSP 8.5. The other one is 2.6. 8.5 is basically bad news. There's no climate medication, mediation or moderation at all, okay? Or mitigation, excuse me. And basically it's just business as usual. We keep pumping out the carbon and the other greenhouse gases just like we are now, and it may even increase. Shared socioeconomic pathway 2.6 is where we get smart and we really start to mitigate climate change and the amount of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, and even start to do some carbon sequestration. Okay, and we just modeled what's going to go on with climate, with rainfall regimes, and under these two scenarios over the entire neotropics, but we had to restrict it to lowland systems. So some of the maps that I'm going to show these big dark areas. That actually just refers to the montane areas where we weren't able to model what's going to go on with rainfall. That's particularly challenging in montane areas. Okay, so I'll show a lot of maps like this. This is really just, again, species richness. And you see a lot of the species richness is in the one here, which is the Amazon basin. A lot here, in Panama and in other areas as well. It gets a little less speciose as you go away from the central areas. But you can see, again, there's about, it's hard to see that total up here, but probably about close to a little over 3,000 species are represented here for the lowland areas. So that's what we have to work with. And the first question we ask is, okay, what's going to happen with climate change or the severity of seasonal drought under SSP 8.5, which again is the business as usual. And you can see that large areas of the neotropics are going to get much drier if the scenario under 8.5 is realized. And a lot of it here is going to be where a lot of the most valuable or most species, where the biodiversity really lies, in the Amazon basin. Some areas are actually going to get a lot wetter under this, and that includes Panama. Okay, this area here on the Pacific coast of the Andes is going to get wetter, but generally it's going to be much longer dry seasons, much more severe seasonal drought. And this is what we would see, what the impact is going to be. And this is basically, we looked at, if you take the number of species in all these areas and you look at what they're going to be faced with, we just came out with sort of a qualitative index of impact. And you can see that there's going to be phenomenal impact on the avifauna of the neotropics in a lot of these areas, okay? The Guianan Shield here, this is Guyana, French Guiana, the Amazon Basin, Colombia, Venezuela, and in the Caribbean as well. And the Caribbean, where it may look kind of like, well, there's no problem there, that's simply because there's not a lot of species there compared to the mainland areas, because there aren't as many species there because they're islands. But if you take this and you look at the exposure based on what are called area restricted endemic species, and on islands you get a lot of endemic, you can see that practically the entire Caribbean, this is Hispaniola, this is Puerto Rico, you can see that there's going to be a lot of issues here where species that conservation biologists worry about a lot, which are small range area restricted endemics, are going to be exposed to changes in rainfall regimes. Now, happily, if you look at, or I hope happily, if you look at the scenario where there is going to be a lot of climate mitigation, it's a lot less of a daunting or challenging situation, where there are going to be changes, okay? Well, there'll still be a lot of drying in the Guianan Shield here, parts of the Amazon Basin, parts of the Atlantic forest, and there'll be a wetter trend. That's curious, but there'll be a wetter trend in here, the Isthmus of Panama, throughout a lot of areas in South America. And as I mentioned before, wetter does not necessarily mean good if you go by sort of the auspices of the hygric niche of some of these tropical systems. But the degree of change and the degree of exposure is going to be far less. You can see here that exposure of these species under 2.6 will be way, way less. Okay, so this is what we hope for. Okay, and this is area restricted endemics. Again, you can see that the impact on of expected climate change under this scenario is going to be a lot less. Okay, and these are just some data you can see under the number of species that are going to be experiencing dry conditions or more seasonal severity drought under the business as usual scenario is daunting. This is over 20% of the world's amphiphora, okay? And you can just see the clear differences on what the outcomes or what the implications are of what happens in the next few years. And it really is going to be determined in the next 20 years or so about which of these scenarios is realized. And I mentioned that I didn't integrate landfall in this. Landfall, other than the most direct habitat loss, also affects rainfall regimes in the tropics. And the reasons for this are that if you have an intact forest in the tropics, rainfall works a little different than it does like in North America. You don't see these big fronts coming in and big storms coming in from, say, the west. In tropical systems, a lot of the rainfall is due to moisture put in the atmosphere from evapotranspiration, okay, evapotranspiration in these forests. And you don't have a lot of runoff. So you get a lot of the moisture just being recycled over and over again, where evapotranspiration builds up, it rains, in the rainy season, goes down, evapotranspiration again. If you lose the forest, okay, you get a lot more runoff and a lot of moisture is lost from the system. So actual deforestation actually exacerbates changes in local rainfall regimes as in addition to climate forcing. So that is not good news, okay? All right, so where do climate refugia come into all this, okay? Well, this is a definition of climate refugia. It's just areas that remain relatively buffered from expected or contemporary climate change. And these are the areas that we really need to think about in terms of priorities for conserving an area or conserving a region, because they may be relatively buffered from climate change and therefore really, really valuable in terms of conserving biodiversity. Now, this is an example from Australia, and this is for amphibians. And what they did was just looked at, this is again under a pessimistic scenario, but you can see here the darker colors are where the prospects for amphibians, in this case, are much, much better than in other areas that if climate change, if we do realize the unhappy or pessimistic scenario, there are areas that, not that they're not valuable and not that they're not important, but they may not be the priority areas in terms for conservation if we want to conserve biodiversity, in this case of amphibians in Australia. Okay, so there's been a lot in the conservation literature. There's been a lot of interest in identifying, understanding, and locating climate refugia, okay? And understandably so, for reasons that I've just outlined, is that some level of climate change is inevitable. Whether we like it or not, it's inevitable. Given that it is inevitable, what should be the conservation priorities? Where can we do the most good by conserving areas? Now, for the work I've done, these are the areas that are currently protected. It's kind of a tatty map here, but these are the areas that are currently protected in the neotropics. And what we did was just overlaid this, or looked at the areas based on changes in rainfall regime, which are pretty much the most important thing. In the tropics, it's not that temperature is not important, and it's not related to changes in rainfall regime. But changes in rainfall regime are the most direct threat to the integrity of neotropical systems. And we just overlaid where, okay, what's going to happen in an area where, by this scenario, where you can see that these are areas that maybe they'll do pretty well, okay? These are areas where under an optimistic scenario, where the changes in rainfall regime are going to be less than 5%. Okay, so areas such as this, okay, I keep mentioning the Guyana Shield. They're going to get a lot drier. These areas here are going to get wetter. Some areas in the Amazon basin are actually going to get significantly wetter, even under a good regime. But a lot of the areas that I showed you that are protected are currently protected in regions that may not be experiencing really, really severe changes in rainfall regimes. Now, that's very different than if under the pessimistic scenario where the white areas here are going to be really threatened. The green area, the blue areas less so, and the green areas are areas that there'll be less than 5% change. You can see that a predominant color here is white. And those are perhaps, I'm not saying that they're not going to be important and they're not valuable for biodiversity, but from this analysis, from this perspective, they're going to be less suitable as protected areas and less suitable as climate refugia than the areas here and the areas here. So again, very daunting under the 8.5 scenario, and that a lot of the neotropics and a phenomenal amount of biodiversity is going to be affected. Now, I want to just break here a little bit, and I want to talk about that. I realize, and everyone that does this kind of work does realize, that these changes, I'm talking about birds and whatnot, but these changes, the most direct thing is going to be with people, with socio-cultural regions, dispossession of people, the level of poverty that may happen because of this, or the level of poverty that may happen and prevent people from being able to adapt to this is really concerning. So I don't want to give the impression that I think people aren't important and that cultural resources aren't important, that indigenous people aren't important. They're the most important, okay? And that I'm not going to be talking about a lot of that directly today, but that has to be factored into all this. If you're going to be talking about climate refugia, you need to have, first and foremost, where are the climate refugia for people, for communities, and for cultural resources. So what does all this mean for Africa? Well, and the sheer tonnage of what I don't know about the ecology and conservation issues in Africa is very daunting. Okay, but I did look some at what's called the IPCC sixth assessment, and that's the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. And there is a very, very interesting and very, very interesting chapter in this report on Africa. And it was the lead author on that was Christopher Trousseau, who I believe is in, well, it says here South Africa. I haven't met Christopher yet. Here's the citation. It's available to everyone. And so I'll be referring a lot to chapter 9 of this. And this is also how it should be cited as well. And what this showed was, again, under different climate scenarios, what's going to be happening with mean temperature change, the number of days above 35 degrees Celsius, precipitation change, and also the intensity of precipitation change. And, you know, a large scale map like this tells you some things in terms of actionable conservation policy. You really need to downscale this to by country or to region. But you can see here a lot about what is being predicted. And if there's one thing that if you do this kind of work, you know that who does the climate modeling and what level and what assumptions go into these climate models really makes a difference, okay? So you see different things with different climate models, but you can see here that this region, that Saharan Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southern Africa are going to be experiencing real differences. Generally, and this is just another map here, generally, okay, what will be happening in places like Tanzania and Kenya is that it may get a little wetter, but the intensity of rainfall, of hard rainfalls, looks like it's going to get more. So we're going to have more flooding, more runoff, more intense, maybe the same or maybe even a little more rainfall, but it's going to come in larger packets, so to speak, and there's going to be very heavy, intense rainfall. In more southern Africa here, by this map, by this particular analysis, it looks like it's going to get drier. And this is just another one. This is change in precipitation intensity. And you can see that there's a lot of variation within Africa, but it does look like rainfall regimes, precipitation regimes, there is going to be a lot of flux here. And that is something that to identify climate refugia for people and for ecology and for biodiverse systems, these things need to be incorporated. So this is just a quick map. I hope it's accurate of the World Protected Database. These are the areas that are currently, at least at large scale, are protected in Africa. You can see a lot of them are in areas that look like they are at tropical latitudes, not that outside of the tropics, the temperate zone areas, south-temperate areas are equally as important. But you can see that a lot of the protected areas are within areas that tropical latitudes and areas that are going to see much warmer temperatures and changes in precipitation regimes. So what we have here is a situation where, okay, we have protected areas. We have a pretty good idea where the biodiversity is. What does that mean for refugia? There's been a little work done on this. This is one recent paper that I came across. And again, I'm probably overlooking a ton of literature, and I hope I can be educated on this when we have a discussion, so that I can be educated and we can talk about this. But this is one paper that I found about where for 3 species of forest-dependent birds, where there may be some climate refugia. But one thing that really alarmed me was, and this is in chapter 9, this report by Trissos and a number of people, is this shows the relative amount of climate, excuse me, I meant to not do that, where there's major gaps in climate change research. Now, if you look at North America, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of climate research, and a lot of participation in climate adaptation, okay? But if you look at large parts of Africa and South America as well, if you look at these areas, there's really a gap in the amount of funding for research, the amount of funding of what we know, and amount of funding in the just sort of the density of publications and knowledge that we can draw on in order to reliably configure conservation policy. And so that's why I was so excited to talk to this group, because they're doing their darn best, from what I talking with Johan earlier, just what they're doing in terms of education and taking what is known and disseminating that and identifying what needs to be known is really impressive and incredibly important. So what's going to happen with climate refugia in Africa? I wish I could show a map that's equivalent to some of the things I showed for South America, but I think it's possible. There's a lot of really talented biologists and a lot of concerned people and a lot of concerned communities in Africa. And again, there may be a lot more that I'm just not aware of, and I want to hear about it. But I think that there's a lot of work to be done everywhere. It appears to me that Africa, and for the sustainability of African ecological systems and the ecological integrity of these systems, that there's a lot of interesting work to be done and a lot of challenges. So with that, I'm going to, I don't know how I stop sharing. I guess I can just press this, but I'd be happy to. I hope we can have a discussion. I hope it's giving you things to think about. And now we can just have a chat.
So the floor is now open for questions. Please raise your hand per the reaction tools at the bottom, or you can even wave at us if the reaction tools don't want to cooperate. Or if you are a bit shy, please grab our attention in the chat. We will also have a look at that. I've seen Marty in tonight, so I'm sure there will be questions. Andrew, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
I think he said he's getting the host is not allowing participants to unmute themselves.
Yeah, that problem seems to have been resolved.
Okay.
Jeff, first of all, thank you. That was an absolutely remarkable talk.
Thank you.
I was in Brazil recently in that sort of arid northeast area, excuse me. And it was fascinating seeing some of the avian biodiversity there. So I've got a question and a comment, if I may. So the question, the SSP scenarios, they don't really take into account these rather dire tipping point scenarios, most notably the abrupt drying of the Amazon basin. Have you guys modeled what would happen if that sudden drying of the Amazon basin were to actually come about?
We haven't. The forest ecologists and there's a person in Brazil who's the Brazilians are doing fantastic work on this, but Carlos Nobre and the late Tom Lovejoy were doing quite a work along those lines. But I have not, it took quite a bit just to get to the point where we were on this, and a lot of computer time. And but that's very important, and that does bring up another tipping points is one issue, but also extreme events. And we didn't figure in extreme events where even if the average doesn't change that much, we may get more variance in seasonal drought. And it may just take 1 or 2 years of really, really bad drought in order to push an area over these tipping points. So I should have mentioned that, Andrew. Thank you for bringing that up. And it doesn't make me more confident or more optimistic, but there is a rich literature on these tipping points and on how extreme events, and a lot of it has to do with ENSO events. And recent work just came out that ENSO events are going to be getting more common and more severe, and that'll affect all of us in the, in South America and in Africa and Australia, everywhere. That it just points more and more to we need to do something about the amount of greenhouse gases we're putting in the atmosphere.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Jeff. And then just a comment, if I may. We're getting really interested in my research group in the effects of humidity on heat dissipation in birds. And what we're learning is that humidity has much stronger effects than I think people have realized until now. And so it kind of, if you look at that sort of intersection between hygric niches and thermal niches, if you like, I think higher humidity in areas with more precipitation in future, if it's combined with high air temperatures, could pose even more challenges for birds in those environments, both in terms of tolerating extreme heat events and also, sustaining exercise during breeding patterns and during breeding seasons and so forth.
Yeah, my student Henry Pollack, who we wanted to, in addition to look at thermal physiology, we wanted to work on humidity, but it just became sort of infeasible for us to do that in the field. But I'm really looking forward to what you find out. I think Holly had her.
Holly, go ahead.
I do indeed have my hand up, but that actually made me think of before I asked my question, because it was actually new to me. Last year in Pakistan, they reached, and Jeff, if you'll give me the name, it escapes me, the point where the humidity no longer allows cooling from sweating. What is that point called?
I don't know what the formal name of it is, but I know what you're talking about.
And actually, quite a few cows and were recorded dying. Andy, you look like Andy would probably know that. No, he doesn't. Andy, you usually know these things. So anyway, what's very interesting for everyone here, because it certainly was new for me, so I assume it could be new for lots of people, is this level of humidity, meaning you can no longer lose heat through sweating or the wind action. And that, if you can give us just a bit more on that, Jeff, because it's quite a new concept for a lot of us.
Well, as Andrew McKechnie just talked about some of the work they're doing, and one way that birds dissipate a lot of their heat is through evaporative cooling. And so if it does get drier, humidity will tend to go down. And I don't know whether generally that's good or bad, but in areas like Panama, if it does get another 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer, and it does get wetter as it's being projected to do, then that may be sort of a two-front attack on the physiology of these birds, and not to mention people, not to mention agriculture, not to mention all sorts of things that we depend on. So, the people that at my university that aren't interested in conservation biology, that are the most interested in what I'm talking here, and there's a lot of work done on this, are the agricultural economists. And they really need to pay attention to this. And because, just because of growing soybeans and whatnot in Brazil, they deforest it, but if they're going to grow soybeans there, they need to be aware of what the changes are going to be, and that's going to affect the food supply and food security as well. So there's no limit to the things that we can talk about, that if it gets as hot as you mentioned in Pakistan, in other places, and there are maps out there where, they're called uninhabitability maps, where if things really go poorly, areas that'll just be uninhabitable, in addition to areas that are going to be flooded out, where there'll just be complete dispossession of an area.
Interesting. So my question comes in, and I don't know if you've come across any research, but let's say in countries like Asia or Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, where eating songbirds is massive. So we talk about these climate refugia also for humans, but at what point, when you talk about agricultural economy and your crops are not doing so well, that the people start eating the birds as well, in terms of the small forest birds or the songbirds, because that in Southeast Asia has had a massive impact on the numbers.
Yeah. Well, I haven't studied this. I can only use my common sense, but it's going to, if food insecurity increases and people are in areas where there's, carbon and food flying around in the form of a bird, they're going to want to eat it. Understandably so. So I think probably, if anything, that will exacerbate that issue. Because it's going to concentrate people, it's going to concentrate the biodiversity, and ambient levels of food security aren't going to get better.
Yeah, it's certainly a changing interface, isn't it? Well, thank you, Jeff. Over to any other questions, or Andy, of course. Good.
I think he needs to get unmuted. Yeah.
Sorry, we accidentally muted you again.
Oh, I don't blame you. You should just do it anyway. Jeff, thank you ever so much. I really enjoyed that. I just wondered, we're running out of time now, in some ways. I just wondered if the information you're pulling together, and you've just touched on this, is being pushed to inform policy, adaptation techniques now. As you're saying, these sort of agronomists should be listening to this now and working out new farming practices. Governments at regional and national level should be factoring some of this in as well. I just wondered if, and businesses as well, who are interested in the long-term viability. I don't know if you've got avenues into them, and whether you're being able to find a practical outlet now as well for all this amazing work.
Yeah, well, we intend to, there's manuscripts in the making here, and we'll get it into the scientific literature, and hopefully then we can start to disseminate some of this. But some of the things I talk about are no surprise. It's well known that there's a lot of work done on climate adaptation in North America. I can guarantee you that. There's all these. I'm involved with something called the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, which involves dozens of universities and whatnot, and we're trying to identify climate refugia in the Midwestern United States. At my university, they're working on, working with other countries to develop rice that can tolerate drier conditions. So there's a lot of GMO work being done, anticipating what the environmental conditions are going to be, and having crops that can having yields that do well in either drier or hotter conditions. that may, in one respect, I think that's incredibly valuable. And in the other respect, it's kind of sad because it's sort of stoically accepting the fact that we're going to see wholesale climate change, but also the very correct assumption that people are going to need to eat, and we need to worry about food security with that and food insecurity as well. So yeah, we can get that information out, but if in the States, if you want, you can, you just get flooded with information about climate change. Unfortunately, it gets a little bit political, and I'm being understated here. So.
Thanks, Andy. Any questions in the chat? I don't see any questions there. So you're welcome to raise your hand. Let us. Jeff, are you worried about disease and the effect of climate change on the spread of disease in the areas that you are working, and also the between zoonotic diseases, human communities?
Yeah, that's an area that I used to do a lot of work on West Nile virus in the States. But as far as disease with the birds go, birds get a lot of, malaria and whatnot, and some of them it's pretty benign, and in other cases it's not. But when you start talking about climate change, especially at tropical latitudes and diseases, then you're talking about changes in the distribution of mosquitoes and the vectors and whatnot. Changes in rainfall will affect changes in mosquito populations that may function as vectors. When West Nile virus hit the United States in about early 2000s, drier conditions actually were worse for the dissemination and amplification of West Nile virus. So sort of dirty water and whatnot that pools up when there's more arid conditions led to more West Nile virus. So deforestation is probably equally an issue in terms of zoonoses, because it gets wildlife into contact more with domestic animals and more with people. So there's two things going on here, but there is a lot of evidence that the distribution of vectors is going to change with climate change.
Wow. A question in the chat from John Musina. Thank you, sir. Please elaborate on the effect of increase of what increases mean of increases in mean participation on migratory birds.
Well, I'll draw on my knowledge of North America for birds that are for what we call neotropical migrants, or long distance neotropical migrants that spend the non-breeding season in the neotropics and then fly up here to breed. My yard right now is filled with migrants because we're right at the migratory season right now. Generally, not dependably, but generally more rainfall. You asked about increases in mean precipitation. That generally is beneficial. There tends to be, if there's a reason, just a little bit more rainfall or an average year, then that tends to be good, as opposed to drought, which is if you started getting more and more drought conditions, the migratory birds don't tend to do as well. But again, we need to think about extreme events, as Andrew McKechnie brought up a question about. So, if somebody told me in Illinois, where I live, if rainfall is going to get, if it's going to get 5 to 10% more mean precipitation annually, for birds that breed in Illinois, for migratory birds that breed in Illinois, I wouldn't necessarily be alarmed, unless they told me that it's all going to come in 3 days. And then if that extra rain all comes in these huge, intense rainfalls, then that could be detrimental. So there's just a lot of moving parts to this stuff that you have to consider. And I try not to give glib, quick answers. I mean, they train conservation biologists to give quick and soundbite answers. And all I can say is there's a lot of moving parts on this one.
That's very true, and that's what makes climate change such a difficult topic to integrate into conservation. Blaine van der Spey, please ask your question.
I think he's muted. There we
There
go.
you go.
Hi, sir. Hi, sorry. Sorry, I just wanted to ask regarding, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I understood it is you're basically saying that the main idea is to try and protect areas that are least susceptible to drastic change. Am I correct in saying so?
That's kind of the meme with climate refugia. Yeah, areas that are buffered,
Okay.
that are expected to be buffered from climate change. Yeah.
Okay, so I might be coming from a point where it's like a little too optimistic, maybe. But would it not be a better idea to sort of try and sort of change the things that are wrong in the areas that are most likely for us that are sort of more susceptible to drastic change? So, for example, in South Africa, we've got a lot of areas that are quite heavily like bush encroached and stuff like that with alien invasives. And that has quite a heavy effect on the water table and stuff like that. So would it not be a better idea to try and like sort of fix those areas a little bit first, so that they stand a higher chance in surviving?
Yeah, I think that would be an excellent thing to do. I mean, that's the danger when you talk about climate refugia. Often one implication, a corollary thought of that is like, well, we'll just let everything else go. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. So I totally agree with what you just said. I think the mindset with climate refugia is we're thinking a little more long-term and projecting out to where our grandchildren are going to be, or my grandchildren, I guess. I don't have any yet, but I hope to, is that, you know, that by 2080, 2100, there'll be some areas that are still retaining some level of ecological integrity. And, but certainly in the short term, you mentioned things like woody encroachment, it sounded like with the bushes and whatnot. Yeah, do what you can there. And that might actually create areas that might function as climate refugia that these large scale maps, these large scale projections don't account for. So,
Okay.
So that's an excellent point.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Thanks, Blaine.